I want you guys to listen to what this white folks actually said. I want you guys to listen to all of the exposure and how he has literally come out to warn his own fellow folks. You know, one thing with these white people is they don't pay attention to listen until when something gets sour. Until when something actually gets to the extreme that they can no longer control. That is when they will start crying and be like, I wish we listen. I wish we listen. You know, and that is why if you check very well in my content, I don't generalize all white folks as bad people. Because I know that there are some of them that are speaking for Black community, despite the fact that we don't trust them 100%. I'll keep saying it. You guys know, I don't sugarcoat on this my channel. The only person I can literally trust 100% is the Black community that got the Black community back. Because there are even some Black folks, like there is one guy, I don't even want to mention his name because as far as I'm concerned, his name is not important to me, that there is nothing we do as Black people that he literally see any good thing about it. But anyways, let me not talk too much. Credit belongs to the original creator of every single clips you are going to be attaching in today's episode. It's just 2 clips. Watch and let me know exactly what you think. Welcome to the channel. My name is Sonia. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. And let's get right into this video. I'll be back with commentaries.
Black folks are still twice as likely to be unemployed as white folks, even when they have a college degree. African American folk with a college degree, 88%, almost twice as likely as white folks with a degree to be unemployed. So if it was just about economic anxiety, Black folks would be flocking to Trump because they're the ones even more likely to be out of work. Oh, you're going to bring the jobs back? Well, then I'm down for that. But that didn't happen. See, the difference between those folks of color and those white folks is that some folks already knew the system was a joke, and some people didn't. And here's what I mean by that. A couple years ago, there was a survey. It found that the most optimistic racial group in America in terms of the future and their opportunities were Black people, and the most pessimistic were white people. Now think about that, but can you help me with this? White people were the most pessimistic, even though we were half as likely to be unemployed. We were 1/3 as likely to be poor. We had 15 times the net worth of Black folks on average, 9 years more life expectancy, half the rate of infant mortality, half the rate of low birth weight children. In every single category of well-being, we generally had twice as much of the good stuff and half as much of the bad stuff, but we were still like, yeah, the wheels are coming off of this thing. Everything's going. And Black folks who had twice as much of the bad stuff, half as much of the good stuff were like, looking up. Now, how is it possible that the group that is in far better shape is so pessimistic? See, there's only one way to look at that. And that is that was all happening right around the recession when that poll was taken. And even though people of color were hurt even worse by the recession than white folks, lost a greater percentage of their wealth, more likely to be laid off, lose their jobs, etc. But there's an extent to which if you're Black or brown in America, you already know, don't you? You already know that this system wasn't set up for you, that you can't assume anything, that working hard and trying hard and playing by the rules doesn't necessarily guarantee you a damn thing. The difference is white America, and particularly white men, have been sold that our whole lives. Black and brown folks knew by the time they were 11 that it was a hustle, right? But if you're a member of the dominant group, you don't realize that. So in a way, privilege was a setup, right? It was a way of saying to you that you'll never have to actually worry about this. And James Baldwin said something about this many years ago. He said that individual who has to snatch his humanity out of the fires of human cruelty that rage to destroy it learns something about himself in the process that no school and no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable because he has to look beneath the words. He has to read between the lines, can take nothing for granted. That individual who is constantly surviving the worst that life can bring ceases to be afraid of what life can bring. See, people of color are not afraid. And as a result of not being afraid, they face whatever is thrown their way. But if you're a member of the dominant group and you've never had to face that uncertainty because you were told that that uncertainty was not for you, That uncertainty was for those people over there on that side of town, those people over there across that border, those people over there who didn't work as hard, you see. And then all of a sudden you discover that this economy wasn't set up for your ass either. It was set up for a handful of people at the top that don't love you, that don't care about you, that just want for themselves. They'll just wall themselves off in gated communities and take care of their own stuff and not really care about any of us. The empathy part's harder, and it's particularly hard, I think, sometimes to be empathetic or empathic to people who empower the likes of the current president and do so in a way sort of maybe perhaps unthinking about what the consequence. And we've seen that, right? Because there's people that are like, well, wait, you're going to cut off the Affordable Care Act? What? Like, don't do that. Well, he told you he was going to do that. Like, why are you surprised? Like, well, I didn't think he was serious. Well, that's like going to a pizza party and being like, now, I hope y'all aren't planning on having pizza. Because I came for the spaghetti. All right, fool. It's a pizza party, fool. What the hell you think they're going to have? He told you pizza. You're going to get pizza. If he tells you, of course, people were like, well, I just thought he was going to cut the Obamacare, not the Affordable Care Act. And so now we better ask as a country what we're going to do about a system of privilege and inequality that is coming back to bite all of us on. It is biting us right now. So if the data says, and it does, that white folks on average have 15 times the net worth of black folks, right? We just assume, well, we must have worked harder. Is that right? That's interesting because actually black folks and brown folks have done some of the hardest work in this country ever since the country was founded. Were it not for the labor of African descended peoples, there would be no country at all. In fact, it was my family, white slave-owning family in the South that got black folks to do all the hard work because we were lazy asses and didn't want to work at all. White folks in the South on the plantation used to want to sit on the porch and drink mint juleps and have carriage rides rather than work, while black folks did all the real labor. And yet we decided that black folks are lazy, which I find fascinating. Reality is the ghetto was created, and public housing in particular was created not for poor black people. It was created for poor white people. And in fact, for the first several years of public housing, people of color couldn't even get into public housing projects. They were essentially segregated by race. Only poor white folks could even live there. And then what happened is the government created some new programs under the FHA program, the VA loan program, later on the GI Bill program, which allowed those same white folks who had been poor and struggling to leave public housing and to leave urban areas and to hustle it out to the suburbs where only we could live, or to the smaller towns where only we were going to be welcome. So what's interesting is that the hood became the hood because only people of color now were allowed to live there. White folks were literally being subsidized by the government to move to the suburbs. The white middle class, and make note of this, was built by government. Government programs that underwrote those loans because those families could not have afforded a loan otherwise. They were able to get one because the government underwrote the loan and guaranteed the loan in case of default, but only for people of color. Only for white folks. People of color, by and large, couldn't get in on any of that. So white folks were able to move, people of color were not. Certain neighborhoods deteriorated economically, other neighborhoods went up in value. At the very same time, the government was doing what they called urban renewal, which meant they came through black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods, and they built interstates right through the heart of the community, right? Knocking down black homes, black apartments, knocking down black-owned businesses all around the country. Between 1950 and 1970, about 1 in 5 apartments or houses lived in by black folks was knocked to the ground for economic development purposes, even though people of color couldn't benefit from almost any of that economic development. So that's how our communities come to look the way they look. Just about from 1900 all the way to the 1930s, 1940s at least, there were race riots where white folks would just go into black communities, burn them to the ground, bomb them from the air like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, rip people out of their homes, beat them in the street, and police sat by, watched it happen, and participated. That doesn't mean that every cop in the modern era is like that, but it means that black folks can be excused for being not so clear on the decency of police in their communities because there's a history there. It was police who dragged black folks and white allies off of those sit-in stools at lunch counters in the South to enforce segregation. See, when your job is to enforce the law, and for most of American history the law was against you as a people, then enforcing the law means you are the first line of oppression. People of color know that history and need to be excused when they don't just get over it, because that continues. It's not about white people, it's about whiteness. It's about a system of white supremacy that has turned us against one another, right? The question is, what do we do now? How do we take responsibility, which is not the same as guilt? Responsibility is what you take because of the kind of person you are. Guilt is what you feel for the stuff you've actually done. Those are two different things. We take responsibility for things even when we're not to blame for them. So that's the first piece. The second piece, the systemic piece, right? Our inability or our lack of willingness to admit that there's also a systemic element to racism, that it's not just about personal prejudice. If it were, it'd be so much easier, right? Because we could just educate people out of their biases, right? And we could somehow undo their personal stuff and everything would be fine. But there's a bigger problem, and it's systemic. It's the way that policies and practices and everyday procedures reinforce inequality between different racial groups, even if there's no overt bigotry in the room. What do I mean by that? Let me tell you a story to make that point. And it's a story about my own life. I am from the South. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. I've lived in the South all my life, 10 years in New Orleans, the rest of it in Nashville. 5 months in Houston, but we don't talk about that. No offense to Houston, I'm just saying, like there are reasons and we will not discuss them. So growing up in Nashville, I went to school in public schools at a time when they had really just become truly integrated. That may seem sort of hard to believe because theoretically, right, the Supreme Court outlawed segregation back in 1954, but as was the case in Nashville, so too was it the case all throughout the South, that very few school systems actually moved toward real desegregation for about 20 years. So it was 1974, the year that I started first grade, that the school system in Nashville was actually truly integrated all the way down to the first grade level. And so by 1979-80, my fifth grade year, right, there were a lot of teachers in that system that had been in there for a really long time. Like they had been teaching since the days of segregation, and they were the kind of people that really preferred the days of segregation, right? So they didn't like having to teach black kids now, but what they really didn't like was having to teach white kids who hung out with black kids. And that was me. See, I told you before, most of the time when we say we have black friends, we're lying. In my case, I pretty much didn't have anything but black friends for the first several years of school because I went to preschool at a historically black college when I was 3 years old. Tennessee State University early childhood ed program. So most of my peers were black kids. So when I got into public school, that's who I was hanging out with. That's who I played ball with. That's who I played on the playground with. That's who I sat in the cafeteria with. And there were teachers who not only didn't like the black kids, but really didn't like me, particularly because of my affinities, both culturally, linguistically, and artistically with black folks. These are the early days of hip hop, and I was that kid. Like I was the white kid that hung out when we would have like rap battles, and I'm not gonna do that shit now because it would be tragic. But in those days, like 79, 80, you could be really bad at that in Nashville and you were still the best on the block, right? Because it was Nashville, it wasn't Brooklyn, it wasn't the Bronx, right? So the teachers really had a problem with who I hung out with and the music that I listened to and who my friends were. And there was one particular teacher, Mrs. Crownover, who was most offended by it. And so one day I get a report card, I have a D- in a reading class, which was what she taught, right? And my mom freaked out because reading was like the one thing I could do, right? If it was a math class, she would have totally not even blinked. She'd have been like, well, at least you didn't fail, you know? Good for you, you got it up from the F last time, you know? But in this particular case, I'd been reading since I was like 2.5, right? So she sort of freaks out, she schedules a parent-teacher conference, she goes to talk to Ms. Crownover, and within about 30, 45 seconds, she realizes that grade had nothing to do with my actual effort, let alone my attitude, let alone my ability to read. It had to do with my social circle because Ms. Crownover looks at my mom within the first minute of the meeting and says, any white parent that would send their kids to public school in this day and age, meaning an integrated day and age, obviously isn't fit to be a parent, they've lost their mind. This, by the way, is not what you want to say to my mother. So within a day or two, she organized with some other parents, and within 2 or 3 or 4 days, she had very directly and unceremoniously made sure that Mrs. Crownover was relieved of her income and her professional duties from there on out. She was forced into early retirement, as she should have been. So good for my mom. On the one hand, that's great. We got rid of the bigot. But remember, I told you it wasn't about individual bigots. It was about systems. And so here's the problem. Even as my mother took action, as she should have, to remove this racist from the classroom where she had no business teaching, right? But the problem was that after Miss Crownover was gone, I went back into a school system that every day, in a very subtle but pernicious way, was sending the same kind of message that Mrs. Crownover was trying to send, which is white students are better, black students are lesser, and they shouldn't be together. How was the system sending that message? Very easy. By putting almost all the white kids in the honors and the advanced level classes, no matter what kind of students we were. I was a lousy student. I wasn't a good student till like last week. I literally got my shit together like Tuesday of last week, right? I wasn't a good student, but I was always in the honors track. And the black kids, no matter how bright they were almost always in the standard or the remedial level track and never moved up no matter how well they did. So the system was sending a message by dividing us and saying that it was division based on ability, but it wasn't. They were sending the message that Crownover was sending. They didn't even need her there to send it, you see. And my mother never saw that. And I never saw that. It went right over our heads. And that's not just a 1979 story. That continues to happen today. Right now in this country, students of color are half as likely to be placed in advanced placement and honors classes compared to white students. Students of color are half as likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers. White students twice as likely to have the most experienced teachers. Right? Black and Latino students 2, 3, even 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, even though they do not break the rules more often than white students. That's the belief, but it's not true. There have been 14 different studies. They all find the same thing, that the rates of serious school rule infractions are virtually identical across racial lines. People bringing drugs to campus, equally across racial lines. People bringing weapons to campus, actually white men more likely to bring guns and knives to campus in K-12 schools than black men or Latino men. Contrary to popular belief, but that's what the Centers for Disease Control research says. But who is it that's getting caught? It's black kids and Latino kids. They're the ones getting searched. They're the ones getting detected. They're the ones getting suspended and often prosecuted. Whereas white students are doing the same thing, doing drugs just as much, bringing weapons just as often, if not more so, and escaping notice. So that's still happening. That's a system, and it doesn't require one overt racist in the classroom for that to continue, right? So that becomes a problem. We have to do more than just look at the individual. We have to look at the way that structures operate, sometimes without us even realizing it's happening. Because if we don't do that, we can get rid of every individual bigoted cop or every individual bigoted teacher or any individual bigoted employer. We can sue them, I guess, in court, and maybe people can even win those lawsuits. But what does that really change unless we take aim at those institutional policies that keep recreating inequality? The third piece, our unwillingness to see how history affects the present, how the past and the present mix. We really don't like this. We really don't want to talk about this. And when I say we, I mean those of us called white especially. There are people of color who don't necessarily always want to engage it either, but especially those of us called white. We'll say things like this when people of color bring up racism. We'll say, well, why can't you just get over it? You know, all of that slavery stuff was a long time ago. In fact, Louis C.K. has this really funny bit, right, where he jokes about how white people have just moved the date of slavery further and further and further back. Like it used to be, slavery was 100 years ago, because it was. And then it was, slavery was 125 years ago, because it was. And now it should be, slavery was 150 years ago, but we'll actually say things like, that was hundreds and hundreds, that was like 1,000 years ago, where we've had slavery for 500 years. When in fact it's very much within the lifetime of people in this room's great-great-grandparents, even sometimes great-grandparents. And in fact, de facto slavery extended well past the Emancipation Proclamation. There were people of color being sent back into virtual enslavement all throughout the first 30 years of the 20th century, being made to work in the mines in places like Birmingham, coal mines there and elsewhere, going back to the very plantations from which their grandparents and great-grandparents had been emancipated, as sharecroppers, as tenant labor, tenant farmers, right? So in fact, slavery isn't that long ago. Segregation certainly isn't that long ago. But here's the point. We don't want to talk about it. And this is really funny that we want to tell black and brown folks to get over the past, because frankly, those of us who are white, we love the past. Absolutely flippin' love the past. How do I know that? Because some of us clearly want to go back to it. How do I know that? Because the Tea Party was a thing. And during that period when the Tea Party was a thing, you had a bunch of white folks go into rallies dressed in Revolutionary War costumes, carrying muskets and wearing powdered wigs. Okay, here's the thing. If you dress up in a Revolutionary War costume with a musket and a powdered wig, calling yourself the Tea Party, which I think is a really old-ass reference, you were in no position to lecture black people about getting over the past. That's all, right? Because by definition, you're still rocking like 1774. You got me? Right? But even now, right, we say things like, what is July 4th? Other than a reference to the past. Like, why do we still celebrate that? Independence Day. We broke away from the British a long ass time ago. That didn't happen last Friday. So why do we still set off fireworks every July 4th, right? I dare you to go up next Independence Day to like the most patriotic guy on the route, you know, with the red, white, and blue wardrobe, because that's an awesome wardrobe palette, and like a big I Heart the USA button on his hat, like flying a flag, blaring Lee Greenwood from the back of a pickup truck. I dare you to go up to that guy, tap him on the shoulder and say, yeah, this is all really nice, this is great, but when are you gonna get over it? Hope you have running shoes on, because he's gonna chase you. Although he'll probably have had enough, slices of mom's apple pie that he won't be able to catch you. But my point being, we love the past as long as it makes us feel good about ourselves, right? When a current presidential candidate says he wants to make America great again, it's a reference to the past, right? It's a reference that says we want to go back to when things were great, but only great for certain people because the time that's being remembered so fondly wasn't so great for everyone. Right? So we love the past as long as it venerates us. We just don't want to deal with the ugly, but that's not how history works. You got to deal with the good and the bad and everything in between, right? And we know that, don't we? Like on a personal level, we know, like, put aside politics and race, just like you as individuals, right? We all come from families that are jacked up in one way or another, right? We all have dysfunction. We all have really messed up stuff in our families, some of which we talk about, a lot of which we never talk about, right? And the fact is, if you ever want, just as an individual, to move past your past, you have to confront it. Whether that's on a therapist's couch or whether that's with friends or a lover or a spouse or a partner, whatever it is, you've got to be willing to confront where you come from in order to get to the next place that's better. But we don't want to do that. We don't do that as individuals and it eats us up. And we don't do that as a country, but we have to do that. Because the past affects the present. Inertia isn't just a property of the physical universe. It's also a property of the political and the economic universe. And here's how I know it's so important. Again, a story involving my own children about why it's so important that we know our history and are able to articulate that and the dangers of not knowing it. So, as it turns out, our daughters are both dancers. And a couple of years ago when they were, let's say, 12 and a half, 10 and a half, I was driving them to dance one day after school, and in order to get to the studio where they were both dancing at that time, we had to drive from the school to the studio. It's about an 8-minute drive, and right in the middle of that drive is a public housing project. And so we're driving the route, we're right in between two sort of public housing developments, and we're there at the red light waiting for it to turn green, and the 10-and-a-half-year-old daughter, Rachel, she looks up, and she says, Daddy, why is it that pretty much everybody in this neighborhood is black? Now that is an incredibly good anthropological and sociological inquiry. It's really very observant and a very important question. Now, the only reason she asked it, she probably noticed in many of our drives to the studio that we were driving through a virtually all black, and you could tell from the infrastructure, poor community. But that was the first day she asked about it. Not the first day she noticed it. I'm sure she'd noticed it. But that day she decided to inquire. And probably the only reason she even bothered was because she figured Daddy might know because Daddy talks about this stuff, so I'll ask him. Like if I was an accountant, she totally wouldn't have asked me that. She'd have been like, how do I do my taxes? I'd have been like, Google it, I don't know, TurboTax, something electronic, right? But she figured I might know, so she asked the question, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? And her sister, of course, because this is what siblings do, right? Older siblings try to show off for the younger sibling. And so the older sister immediately jumps in to impress Daddy with the answer, which she somehow knew, or at least in part. She jumps in, she says, redlining, which oddly enough was true. And for those who don't know what redlining is, I'm about to explain, right? So it turns out that in fact in this country, the reason that people of color disproportionately live in lower income communities and urban areas is in fact because of this thing, among others, called redlining. And what that was that for generations, And it was perfectly legal to do this, by the way, up until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed. It went on for generations where you had banks that would take red markers on big maps in their offices, in the loan office of the bank, and they would draw lines around black neighborhoods, and occasionally Latino neighborhoods too, but especially black neighborhoods. And they would say anybody who lives within the boundaries of these lines cannot get a loan from the bank. You're not going to get a mortgage loan for a house. You're not going to get a business loan to start up your own business. Didn't matter what your credit record was, by the way. Didn't matter if you had a good job. Didn't matter what your occupational status or your education was. Simply living in that community meant you were not going to get a loan. So when my daughter says redlining is in part implicated, it wasn't the full picture, but it was a big piece of it. The bigger picture being a history of discrimination, who could live where and who couldn't. And so I explained that to my daughter, the 10-year-old, of course. When her sister said redlining, she said, yeah, I don't know what that means. And I said, yeah, neither does your sister. She's just showing off. But I explained it, took about 3 minutes, real simple little 3-minute discussion. Wasn't a long conversation, right? But it was enough to let her know that history matters. When we decide that we will clean up the residue of what other folks left us, even though they did it without our permission and without our involvement, when we decide that we're tired of living in that, we will clean it. Not because we are to blame, not because we are guilty, but because we're the only damn ones left.
Anyways, welcome back, and I hope you guys listened to exactly everything he said from beginning to the end, where he literally broke everything down for a layman understanding. And there is no two ways about it. Everything he said is absolutely right, is absolutely correct, because over time, black people has literally been going through a whole lot. Black people have literally been going through oppressor, where they literally build things and people just take it as if it's theirs and never give credit to them, where they have literally suffered on segregation. Is it the Jim Crow? Like, which one do we literally talk about that black folks has not gone through? And that is why I keep saying it. When I see some of these white folks airing out the truth, saying it as it is without the fear of favor, I really do appreciate them, despite the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, I don't still trust them 100%. Because I remember last month, I think that was last month or last 2 months, where we have this white lady literally supporting the black community until something happened and she flamed off and she called black community every kind of name, spelled every kind of words on them, called them a lot of things that at the end of the day we now said, oh, we see reasons why a lot of black folks, we keep saying that they really do not trust most of these people. But this man has been sincere enough, come out to his chest and own up and say a lot of things that has literally been going on in the black community, and of which is absolutely true. I read a particular article yesterday where I think it was this lady that posted it. Is it Ashley? I don't know if you guys are actually following her on TikTok or YouTube. I followed her on both places, where she literally dropped a particular video where she said, not article, sorry, a video where she explained how this black woman suffered in the hands of these white folks, was abandoned in a, that was back then, not even now, right? Was abandoned in a head without treatment, and this black woman tried her possible best to see how she can bring herself back to life. And then she started learning how to write herself, learning how to write with her feet, learning how to do a lot of things. And she got to her feet and she started supporting black people, invented a particular feeding machine. I don't know if you guys have actually seen that particular story. Invented this feeding machine, and of which, when she invented it, she took it to these white folks for all this, they said it was not good, it was this, it was that, threw her out, and she continued doing what she knows how to do best. But guess what they did to this lady? Guess what they did to her? They later went to steal the ideas from her, never gave her credit, and they never made her exist. Do you get? That is what we have literally been going through as black folks over time after time. And at the end of the day, when you see videos like this, you tend to relate to it and know that this is actually what black people has actually been going through. But the good part I love with this generation is the freedom that we have, is the fact that we are speaking up, is the fact that a lot of things right now are definitely going to be corrected. A lot of things right now are definitely going to be put in place. A lot of things right now are definitely going to be said as it is. And that's why I'm so happy that people are no longer keeping quiet. People are now airing out. People are now talking, especially the Black community. And I said it in one of my videos. I said, if this was how our forefathers were actually speaking out, saying the words, doing what they know that they know how to do best, I think where we are right now would have been more than where we are. Because as I'm talking to you guys right now, the palm-colored people are scared. They're scared of the Black community. That is why they don't want to give us power. That is why they don't want anything that will make a Black person outstanding out there. But anyways, let me know what you think. Credit belongs to the original creator of every single clips I insert in today's episode. If you have not subscribed, what are you waiting for? Subscribe, like, comment, and share. And thank you so much for always supporting. Thank you for watching. Thank you for always dropping commentaries. I do not take you guys for granted. You guys are literally the best. Anyways, with that being said, with no further ado, I do like I say in my videos, I'm going to be simple and I'll see you guys in my next one. For now, bye guys. I love you guys. Mwah. Keep talking as a Black person and don't make your voice not to be heard, no matter the situation surrounding you, no matter the problem that you might be facing. That's my voice for you.